Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. He comes to us from Washington, D.C. His name is Salih Hudayar. Last name is spelled Hudayar. And he works with the East Turkestan government in exile. So if you're watching this on one of my three YouTube channels or X or Rumble, you will see the logo for the East Turkestan government in exile. A lot of people in the West don't know this name. They hear the word from the Chinese side, Xinjiang, which is, I think it translates in Chinese to New Frontier. I call it the Brave New Frontier. It's super dystopian. He's not my first guest to discuss East Turkestan. I had a guy on 6 years ago from Australia. His name was Arslan Hediat, and things have really kind of accelerated in this environment. And his name came across my desk, and it just turned on a light bulb. I'm like, oh, I should follow up on this because there's so many themes that are happening. I think in East Turkestan, in the world at large, even in the United States, this kind of cultural engineering. I think East Turkestan's super Orwellian. I try to add it to the title, but all my titles are like 100 letters, so I can't put in all the words I want to put in. But there's a lot to talk about, and I'm really glad that he's here. So, Salih Hudayar, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
For people who haven't heard your name or aren't familiar with East Turkestan or the East Turkestan government in exile, can you just kind of talk about your background, how you ended up in Washington, D.C., and kind of lead up to what's going on in East Turkestan in 2025?
Yes. My name is Salih Hudayar. I am an Uyghur. I was born in East Turkestan, in Atush, East Turkestan, which is about 45 kilometers northwest of Kashgar. A lot of people are more familiar with Kashgar because it is historical capital of East Turkestan, as well as the cultural capital of East Turkestan today. I was born in East Turkestan, and my father was forced to flee East Turkestan in 1995, following the Chinese government's, campaigns to suppress our nascent or resurging independence movement following the fall of the Soviet Union. So East Turkestan. The reason it's called East Turkestan was historically all of Central Asia used to be one entity known as Turkestan. It had smaller kingdoms inside it, but as a whole, for outsiders, it was known as Turkestan since the 5th century CE. In the 18th century, the Russians began invading East Turkestan from the west. Invading Turkestan from the west, and the Chinese from the Manchu Qing dynasty from the east. So in 1730 was the first time that Turkestan began to become distinguished between east and west. 1730. And East Turkestan was, again, geographically, as you can see, there's this mountain range. East of that mountain range, the Taurtag Mountains, and east of Kashgar became known as East Turkestan, and the west of that became known as West Turkestan. In 1759, the Qing Empire invaded East Turkestan. The Manchu Qing dynasty invaded East Turkestan and annexed it as a military colony, whereas the Russian Empire invaded and occupied West Turkestan. And the Qing Empire initially governed East Turkestan as a military colony from 1759 to about 1864, during which the people of East Turkestan organized 42 major uprisings against the Qing Empire. And in 1865, we succeeded in restoring our independence as the state of Yettishar, or which is known as the Seven Cities, referring to the most prominent 7 cities in East Turkestan. And historically, on maps, it was known as East Turkestan. In 1876, the Manchu Qing Empire reinvaded East Turkestan, and in 1884, they annexed it as Xinjiang, meaning the new territory or the new frontier, or if you look at the original English-Chinese dictionary from 1893, the colony. During the 20th century, the East Turkestani people continued to resist against the Qing Empire. The Qing Empire fell in 1912 after the Chinese Revolution, and we had our own independence movement that led to the establishment of the first East Turkestan Republic in November 12th, 1933, which was overthrown by a combination of Soviet and Chinese forces in 1934, and then we reestablished our independence again in 1944 as the East Turkestan Republic once again. And this time, the Soviets initially supported it because of their own geopolitical calculations at the time. However, in 1949, the Soviets supported Mao in invading and occupying East Turkestan. Prior to the Chinese invasion, Mao called the leaders, the top senior leaders of the East Turkestan Republic, to a meeting in Almaty, and there they were assassinated. And then the Soviet Union staged a plane crash, stating that they died in a plane crash. And so that's the official Soviet narrative, is that they were killed in a plane crash. But if you look at if you read the book Special Tasks, which is the English translation, it was by Pavel Sudoplatov, who was the head of the Soviet MGBM, which is like the military intelligence. And he wrote this book. He published this after the fall of the Soviet Union. And in it, he states that the leaders of the East Turkestan Republic were executed in the former stables of the Tsar Empire, Tsar stables in Almaty, after they refused to give up East Turkestan's independence and voluntarily merge with Mao's People's Republic of China. So on October 1st, 1949, the PRC, Mao declares the People's Republic of China. And then 11 days later, on October 12th, 1949, with the support of the Soviet Union, Mao's Communist Red Army invades East Turkestan. And 2 months later, almost 2 months later, on December 22nd, 1949, the East Turkestan Republic is formally overthrown, and China exerts control over East Turkestan. In 1955, China renamed East Turkestan as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in an effort to quell or to push back against Uyghurs' demand to for their independence again. And at that time, we have to underscore one thing. In 1949, there were 9 million Turkic peoples in East Turkestan, according to Mao. According to the East Turkestan Republic's government, in 1946, our population was about 7 million, 1946. By 1949, it was about 9 million, according to Mao. And there were less than 300,000 Chinese in the whole of East Turkestan. And that is the Chinese soldiers and their civil servants that they sent to conquer East Turkestan. By 1955, the Chinese had grown to over 6% of the population, growing from less than 2%, whereas Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples, Uyghurs made up over 90%, and the other Turkic peoples made up roughly about the other 7%. And so over the years, China began to essentially colonize East Turkestan, turning it into a colony. In 1954, Mao set up the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which is a paramilitary corporation entity that answers directly to Beijing. Despite that, we have an autonomous region, it doesn't respond or it doesn't answer to the autonomous region. It answers directly to the Central Committee of the Communist Party in Beijing. So the XPCC was essentially set up to crush any resistance and to colonize East Turkestan. So by the course of history, by 1990s, by the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, the Chinese population grew from less than 2% at the time of invasion to over 30%, whereas the Uyghur population went from over 90% of the population to less than 60% by 1990, by the fall of the Soviet Union. And with the fall of the Soviet Union and the independence of the countries of West Turkestan, which is now Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, this gave a resurgence in our independence movement. And there was a large mass protests, some small scale armed resistance activities. Mostly, actually, all of it was aimed primarily against Chinese government, military facilities, and security forces. And there were large protests. In 1996, the Chinese Communist Party held a top secret meeting in Beijing on preventing East Turkestan's independence, and they issued a top secret document called Document Number 7 of 1996, titled Stability Maintenance in Xinjiang. And they highlighted that national separatism, or the national independence movement of East Turkestan, was the greatest threat to so-called stability to China's rule in East Turkestan, but also to the whole of China itself. And they began to, they accused the U.S., even though the U.S. wasn't remotely involved or didn't even care about our issue. They accused the Western so-called counter-revolutionary forces being led by the United States of trying to encourage sabotage and so-called separatism in East Turkestan. And so China issued Document Number 7, which includes a 10-point directive, which calls for moving more Chinese colonists to colonize East Turkestan, moving more Chinese troops into the region, crushing our cultural and religious practices, crushing our language, eroding it from being taught in schools, to even infiltrating and winning over, infiltrating, co-opting diaspora organizations, communities, and leaders to prevent you and use all means to prevent the internationalization of the East Turkestan problem. So in 2000, by then, China co-opted the governments of the Central Asian republics, including Turkey, to subvert our organizations in the West, in diaspora, in Central Asia and in Turkey, to where advocacy for East Turkestan became outlawed by 1998, 1999. And then after 9/11 happened, China began to use the global war on terror to claim that it's fighting against terrorism in East Turkestan and trying to connect our independence movement to global jihadism and global, terrorism. So China fabricated 2 months after 9/11 the so-called East Turkestan Islamic movement. The first ever mention of this was November 11th of 2001, 2 months after 9/11 at the UN, when China claimed that it was a victim of so-called East Turkestani terrorism and that it was being directed by the East Turkestan Islamic movement. And of course, China tried to get the US and many countries to recognize this non-existent entity as a terrorist organization, along with all Uyghur organizations. The US refused, and many countries refused, but the US and the UN ultimately acquiesced to the so-called ETIM narrative in exchange for US entrance into Iraq, so that China wouldn't veto it at the UN Security Council.
Sorry to interrupt, Salih. So what you're saying is the Chinese invented their own organization claiming it was Turkish. So the ETIM was not something organically from the East Turkestan political background. Is that what you're saying? So no. It's almost like Lenin, where he said the best way to
control the opposition is to
create it. So that's what happened to you. Wow. So yeah. It's the same playbook.
So this is exactly what Document Number 7 calls for, is to use propaganda, use all means to prevent the internationalization of the East Turkestan problem. because in the 90s, late 90s especially, we were getting attention to our issue. We were getting, some form of attention to our issue at the UN level, as well as from the international media, and even governments were, starting to talk about our issue. So China preempted this by creating the so-called ETIM. And so while China's crushing our nationalist organizations and arresting people during the Strike Hard campaign, China let, quote, releases from prison a handful of so-called Islamists, or they claim to be Islamists. Our people believe they were Chinese intelligence operatives, and sends them off to Pakistan. Pakistan is China's all-weather ally, its best partner. And there, these handful of individuals are greeted by and hosted by the Pakistan Islamic Party. And there they create the so-called East Turkestan Islamic Party, which in September of 1997, and claims that, their goal is to unite the East Turkestan Mujahideen with the international, Mujahideen, and to build a global Islamic caliphate. The exact propaganda that China needs to, demonize our movement.
To justify their
Yeah.
incursions or whatever,
Yeah.
their oppression.
So,
Yeah.
so this went on, and then after 9/11, China began using the framework of we're fighting against terrorism to essentially outlaw and ban our any mention of East Turkestan, to where if you even say the words East Turkestan, you're a terrorist.
Wow, that's incredible. It's almost nobody uses it here in the States. Like they just say Xinjiang. They don't.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't even know. They don't understand. Also, like it's part of the Turkic diaspora. You used that term earlier. So this is the east part of this amazing cultural, ethnic legacy of a lot of different tribes of Turkic origin from the borders of China to current day Turkey. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that fair?
And
okay.
At the same time, while they're doing this, they also assassinated many of our independence leaders, our actual nationalist independence leaders in Central Asia, in Turkey, and other places. And they co-opted many of the organizations to where our organizations went from advocating for independence and using East Turkestan to were just only about, Uyghur human rights and cultural autonomy under Chinese rule. We want better rights under China. So this is the narrative that China shaped. But to keep our independence movement alive, some of our leaders, our main leader before he was assassinated in August of 2004, he was based out of Kazakhstan.
What was his name?
Uzbek Mukhlisi. Uzbek Mukhlisi. He was a former colonel in the East Turkestan National Army of the Second East Turkestan Republic, and he had fled to the Soviet Union in 1960. And there he led the East Turkestan National Committee and the East Turkestan United Revolutionary Front of East Turkestan, which was like our de facto government in exile at the time. And he had convinced, because the Central Asian governments had outlawed East Turkestan advocacy in Central Asia as well. So he had persuaded, he had met with the U.S. State Department, met with many American members of Parliament, Congress, and he was able to persuade the U.S. to allow us, at least, to allow us to set up our government in exile in Washington. And so our government in exile was formed in Washington in September 14th of 2004. And it's been based here ever since. And the whole purpose of our government in exile is to keep the East Turkestan independence cause alive, to keep our cause of national sovereignty and independence, and to advocate for the restoration of East Turkestan's independence, and to push back against China's revisionist colonial narrative and genocidal policies in our country. However, by 2014, China, Xi Jinping came to power and launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. And the Belt and Road Initiative is a multi-trillion-dollar, on the surface, it's a global infrastructure project created by China to revive the ancient Silk Road and to foster trade and development, etc. That's the surface level, but in reality, it's China's foundation for global expansion and global domination, because many of these uh, infrastructure and whatever projects that China is investing in, it's about control of key ports, including seaports, key railway, key airports, to where it facilitates both trade and dominance for China. But also, if there's a military conflict, China has access now to further expand. And if, in fact, the whole point of the Belt and Road is actually part of their war planning strategy. So in 2009, in November of 2009, at China's National Defense University, a senior PLA Air Force colonel, now he's a general and he's the head of China's National Defense University. He held a lecture on the future war between the United States and China, which he speculated or estimated or proposed would happen around 2030. And he states, what is the biggest threat that we have right now, that we are facing, that China faces right now? What is preventing China from taking Taiwan? And in that 2.5 hour lecture, he asks, all these his students and people that are visiting, hearing this lecture, which includes Chinese ministers and security officials and senior military officers, and they all throw out different things. And he said, "No, it's the East Turkestan problem, because if you look at the map, East Turkestan is what connects China to Central Asia and ultimately to the Middle East, and ultimately any Western connection has to run through East Turkestan." And he said if China gets into a war with the United States over Taiwan, immediately what the U.S. will do is they'll put up a blockade in the Strait of Malacca, which is about 80% of China's sea-based trade, including its oil and natural gas imports, go through the Strait of Malacca. So he said if they were to put up a blockade, we will not be able to sustain that war. So what do we have to do? We have to turn west. We have to turn through land-based. And this is what the Belt and Road Initiative is about. It's to deter that. It's about China's attempts to, circumnavigate or circumvent a potential, blockade in the Strait of Malacca. But at the same time, he said, but the reason the East Turkestan problem is the biggest threat is because if we get into an armed conflict either way, the United States could easily arm 300,000 to 500,000 Uyghurs overnight, and they would cut off our west to east pipelines, including their energy grids. So everything that goes in, all the oil pipelines, natural gas, even everything that goes from the Belt and Road Initiative, it runs through East Turkestan. Without it, there is no Belt and Road. So he said we have to deal with this. This is the greatest threat that we have. And he said on the surface, we're going to have to play it off as counterterrorism, that we're fighting against. He said on the surface, we're going to push it off as counterterrorism. But of course, we know that it's not that. And then he said, we actually should be praising Osama bin Laden and thanking him for keeping the United States busy, giving us the opportunity to develop. If America hadn't been kept busy for the past 9 years, we'd have difficulty, in developing if they had focused on us instead. So he was like saying that if he had an option, he would have awarded bin Laden with a medal or something. So this is what it's all about: the Belt and Road Initiative and China's, pre-war planning strategy, you could say, in the sense that they fear that the people of East Turkestan, which we have always been resisting against, Chinese occupation of our homeland, would potentially resist if a conflict breaks out between China and a greater power. And so China doesn't want that to play as a factor. So initially, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. And Xi Jinping, in his opening statement that he made in Kazakhstan, he said by the end of this century, the world will speak Chinese. And he's not saying that in a in a figurative way. He's being very literal about it, because if you look at everything that's being tied with the Belt and Road Initiative, there's another soft power thing, which is China's opening up Confucius institutes, requiring all these countries to open up Chinese schools and teach Chinese language in their countries. And we're talking about countries as far as countries like Belarus in Europe to countries in Africa. And many of the infrastructure projects that are, quote, being built, China is not doing this for free. It's giving them loans to these countries. And these countries, most often are not going to be able to pay off these loans.
It's classic colonial manipulation,
And so there's
burden them with loans.
stipulation in those contracts. If you're not able to pay these loans in time, you have to lease it, automatically transfer it to us for 99 years, for 100 years, essentially. But they put 99 years. So this is the classical thing.
Right. So new colonialism. It's
Yeah.
the same as the Europeans used to do it. Now it's Chinese, right?
And now
all over Africa. I've heard the Belt and Road reaches all the way to the Balkans, like literally north of Greece.
Exactly.
And all that stuff,
yeah, like Belarus, Serbia, all of the,
yes.
Even Kosovo is being, even Bosnia is being implemented.
Prepped, yeah.
Italy, it reaches Latin America as well, Africa, and many of the things is the Chinese government is sending their labor. So they're saying, we will build these roads for you. We will invest, but we're going to use our own labor. So they're bringing in Chinese, hundreds of thousands of Chinese males to these countries, and they're setting up mini colonies inside those countries. And especially in Africa, you're seeing a lot of African women that are marrying Chinese men because, again, they want a husband that can financially provide for them. The Chinese are not employing the local Africans to build these roads, these hospitals, these railways. They're bringing in Chinese males. So this is another notorious fashion of colonialism that China is doing.
Which is happening in East Turkestan as well, right?
Well, in East Turkestan, it's been happening for the past 76 years. I mean, we've been facing the brunt of that. And as I just told you, the demographic shift. The Chinese went from less than 2% in 1949 to over 40% today. We went from over 95% of the population to, according to what the Chinese government claims, Uyghurs make up about 40% of the 45% of the population today.
Is it the same population that you said? So is it still 7 million, or is it because that so many Han have moved, or how many Chinese have moved in?
The Chinese went from less than 300,000 to over 10 million today.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's just a massive move, and that's why it's gone down. So there may be the same amount. Is this an accurate map of Eastern Turkestan?
This is the map of East Turkestan, what is the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, what China declared as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Whereas the most accurate map of East Turkestan is the one right behind me.
Gotcha. Let me see if I can bring that up.
And a part of our territories right here was annexed. China annexed it further into Gansu province, Qinghai and Gansu province. And then in that map that you showed, this area right here, which is India, which China occupied in 1962 and annexed it into the Aksai Chin region. They annexed it into the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in 1962 after the 1962 Sino-Indian War. So in 2014, to justify this, genocide, what does China need to do? It has to show that it's facing a security threat or a terrorism threat. So as part of the conflict in 2011, you had the Syrian conflict erupting. And if you look at what's happening now, I mean, Turkey played a vital role in the conflict in Syria. And so Erdogan, Xi Jinping visited Ankara, visited Turkey in February of 2012, and again they discussed cooperation on Syria and trade. 2 months later, Erdogan visits in April of 2012, visits both East Turkestan and China. And again, the agenda is Syria and trade. And then China pretty much turned a blind eye. Chinese intelligence facilitated this with Turkish intelligence, and they allowed tens of thousands of Uyghurs to flee out of East Turkestan, despite they have already set up, checkpoints. You can't leave from one city to another without hitting a checkpoint. But about 30,000 Uyghurs were allowed to leave by Chinese intelligence network, Chinese and Turkish intelligence networks, where they fled through East Turkestan into Southeast Asia, into Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, and then they were, quote, rescued by Turkish NGOs and brought over to Turkey and then bussed into Syria. This happened between 2012 and 2014. And then many of these Uyghurs were thrown into, militant groups in Syria being supported by Turkey. And some ended up fighting against Kurds, others were forced to fight against the Assad regime. And then they began creating propaganda videos. Initially, the Chinese government claimed that it's fighting against terrorism. And Xi Jinping visited East Turkestan in late April of 2014, and declared that it was the front line against China's fight against terrorism. He visited Kashgar, and this is where he made the notorious speech to absolutely show no mercy and to arrest those who need to be arrested, to quote, re-educate those who need to be re-educated, and to stamp out so-called separatism.
So he said he made that speech in East Turkestan. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
He made that speech in East Turkestan while visiting a military base.
And that was what, 2015?
2014. In April 28th of 2014. Then 2 days later, he leaves. And as soon as 2 hours after his plane takes off, a bombing happens at a train station in Urumqi, an indiscriminate bombing. And again, China immediately claims that it's the so-called ETIM, or the Turkestan Islamic Party. And the Uyghur militants that are under, Turkey's control in Syria, and Afghanistan, they create a video stating that, oh yes, we claim responsibility for this. Then another bombing happens at a vegetable market, indiscriminate bombing. And what many Western experts noted at that time was like, why the hell are Uyghurs all of a sudden, going from bombing and fighting against Chinese military and government, personnel, to these indiscriminate bombings? They couldn't explain what was causing this, And of course, we believe this was Chinese false flag operations to justify it, because immediately they claimed this was, ETIM, that it was the TIP who did it, and TIP in Syria and Afghanistan, they released videos claiming, quote, responsibility. And then China said, oh, we have a terrorist threat. These Uyghurs are going off into Afghanistan and Syria, and they are over there. They want to create a global Islamic caliphate. We have an Islamist terrorism threat. And so they launched the so-called People's War in May of 2014. That's the official term, the People's War against so-called terrorism, or against violent terrorism, or not, and separatism. And so this is the official euphemism that China has been using for its ongoing genocide, and it's ongoing. So they initially started arresting young men between the ages of 15 and 45. Between 2014 and 2016, it's estimated they arrested about 200,000 men between the ages of 15 and 45, on the basis that they're become prone to become radicalized and rebel against the state. Then when the international community, of course, didn't say anything, there was no condemnation, no uproar. 200,000 men is a lot. It's not a small number. If you
as a proportion of your population, it's a huge amount.
Yeah. Well, even to say that, oh, you have a terrorist threat and you arrested 200,000, quote, terrorists. That's something else. That's not terrorism right there. that means you have a different problem. But of course, this is the game that China plays, and the international community buys into it. Nobody condemns China because again, it's only men, and China is claiming, oh, we're fighting a terrorism. And then
There's so much political power involved too,
yeah,
and financial power.
yeah,
So if
and
you criticize it, like, oh, you could lose business, or we can punish you, or whatever. So yeah,
exactly. And by 2016, they roll it out to everyone. In fact, they state that the Chinese government states that everyone that they start sending Chinese officials to our homes. So every Uyghur family would have a Chinese quote as part of a pair up program. They sent 2.2 million Chinese officials, and they paired up a Chinese official with every household, and that Chinese relative of yours would come to your home. He would monitor you for an entire week, and he would grade you from 0 to a scale of 100. If you got anything lower than a 90, you were deemed a security threat. And includes if you're a young man, if you have facial hair, if you have a beard like mine, automatically you lose 10 points automatically. That's one of the red flags. You lose 10 points. If you have ever practiced any form of religion, it doesn't matter if it's Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, whatever, you lose another 10 points. If you have ever traveled overseas, you use 10 points. If you've ever contacted anyone overseas, so if you have relatives like mine, and you have relatives that live across, in other parts of the country, you lose 10 points. If you have ever, owned a tent, owning a tent, you lose 10 points. If you have knives that have been, every family is allowed one knife. If you have more than that, you lose 10 points. If you have anything that is political or religious in your home, you use 10 points. So a lot of people obviously are not going to,
right. It's enforced cultural engineering. So
yeah.
then nobody's going to want to lose points. That's what they want to get
No,
rid
but
of and
like I
strip
said,
from
a
the
lot of people
population, right?
are not going to get less than 90. Less. A lot of people are not going to get above 90 points. Like there's no way.
Right.
There's no way. If you're a young man and you have, like if you have weights in your home, if you have like, arm dumbbells and stuff like that, or a gym or bench press, anything like that, you lose 10 points because again, you're training to rebel against the state. That's why if you're not training to look good for yourself or feel healthy or to look good for the ladies or something. You're engaging in fitness to rebel against the Chinese state. This is the level of paranoia. And then if you refuse, like the Chinese government, because we're Muslim, if your Chinese government minder brings pork to you and you refuse to eat it, you lose 10 points because again, you're an extremist. You must be a terrorist for refusing to eat pork. If they offer you cigarettes and you refuse to smoke that cigarette, you lose 10 points because again, you must be a religious fanatic if you want to, an extremist for refusing to smoke because again, smoking is quote haram, eating pork is haram. Same thing with alcohol. If they bring alcohol and they ask you to drink it, you refuse. The same thing. If you have women in your household, and you've probably seen videos of it. There's videos of this where the Chinese government itself promotes this as uniting the two ethnic groups like pomegranates, where they will force our women to sleep with the Chinese, to share the same bed as our Chinese government minder, which is always a male. And if we refuse, you're an extremist. So if you refuse to be raped, you're an extremist, you're a terrorist, you're sent to the concentration camps. Initially, the U.S. Department of War in 2019 estimated that there was at least 3 million or more Uyghurs that had been sent to the concentration camps. And they have over 1,400 concentration camps across East Turkestan. And China initially denied it, instead and called it, re-education camps. These aren't concentration camps. These are re-education centers where, these people have been infected by, extremist thoughts, illegal thinking that needs to be corrected. So we're providing them with we're re-educating them, we're teaching them the Chinese language, we're eliminating their extremist behaviors and thoughts and so forth. This is the way the Chinese government portrayed it. However, when you look at satellite imagery, because you can find this on Google Earth, if you look at the imagery of these camps, because luckily there's you can see when these camps were starting to be built. The foundations for these camps were made, because they have to clear the lands, they have to bulldoze it, excavate it, etc. They were done as early as 2011, 2012 in many cases. So China was planning this long before it officially rolled it out. And
They're
so,
huge dystopian,
yeah,
so-called, their euphemism is re-education and
it,
something
it,
else
it's
facility. It's
yeah, it's essentially concentration camps,
yeah,
because they have
training. Well, you're getting training there too.
yeah, they
Yeah,
have
supposedly.
high barbed wire, high walls, barbed wire fences, watchtowers. Nobody can enter, nobody can
Yeah,
leave.
mega surveillance too. So it's
Yeah,
not just
yeah.
like that. Like you're a surveillance state now. Yeah.
So in 2020, in September of 2020, after the international community began to, condemn what China was doing, these, the horror of these concentration camps, China released a white paper claiming that they provided us with vocational education and training, and that these weren't concentration camps, but these were indeed vocational training facilities where we were being provided with, job training, Chinese language instructions, etc., to, uplift us from poverty. And you have billionaires, you have Uyghur billionaires that are in these camps, were thrown into these camps. They're not poor. They're not poor. You have businessmen. You have,
It's also labor too. Like it's not a camp. You're there doing hard labor
yeah.
at
So
times too.
this is where China began, after the international community began to call out these concentration camps. China stated that these were vocational training facilities. And in that white paper, the Chinese government admitted that between 2014 and the end of 2019, that every year they provided 1.29 million Uyghurs with so-called vocational training in these camps, or roughly 7.8 million of our people were thrown into these camps for vocational training. And then they stated that they provided, many of them graduated these vocational training camps, and they uplifted 3.5 million of our people, Uyghurs, and provided them with stable jobs. So 3.5 million out of that number was thrown into slave labor, forced labor facilities, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of our people, our youth especially, were moved out of East Turkestan to work in Chinese factories across China.
Wow. So
And
they were
this,
not just in East Turkestan. They're
yeah,
taken through
this is
China.
to disperse our population.
Right.
On top of that,
Over.
over 1 million of our children were forcibly taken from their parents and put into state-run boarding schools, because again, before, by 2000s, the Chinese government had implemented a so-called bilingual uh, education policy, which is essentially monolingual. And bilingual meaning after you finish high school, you can learn Uyghur. Until then, everything is in Chinese. So this is the way that they had educated the education system. However, they learned that, even though you separate the kids and educate them in Chinese in schools, they still are going to end up going home. They still interact with their parents, and they're still going to, keep their language alive at home, because their parents are going to speak to them in Uyghur and not Chinese. They're still going to be able to keep part of their culture and, alive. So the Chinese government is like, oh, how do we deal with this? Oh, well, we need to separate these kids from their parents. So they forcibly separated 1 million children from their parents and put them up into so-called boarding schools, which are essentially internment camps for children. Because again, barbed wire fencing, security checkpoints, high watchtowers, just like the concentration camps. You can't go in or out. You can't even visit your children, and they're educated they're dressed up in traditional Chinese clothing that the Chinese themselves don't dress up in China. It's to humiliate them, to separate them from their identity and roots. Many of them are also, you can find videos on Chinese social media and Chinese state propaganda where Uyghur children are dressed up in miniature Chinese PLA, People's Liberation Army
Oh,
uniform,
wow. Yeah.
instructed by Chinese People's Liberation Army officers, and raised to, they're indoctrinated to become future soldiers of China, to fight against the imperialists, to fight against the terrorists, etc. And this is the way that China is transforming our,
It's like a massive demographic, cultural re-engineering, warfare, terraforming, or whatever. Like, it's really incredible.
Then there's in addition to that, then there's the forced sterilization of our women. So according to the Chinese government's own data, they've forcibly sterilized over 300,000 women, Uyghur women, between 2014 up until 2019. So, and it's still ongoing. And in some places of East Turkestan, they put up 0% growth rates for our population. The Chinese government's own state media reported that between 1989 and 2009, they forcibly aborted 3.7 million of our babies because they were, quote, illegal births. So this is, they killed 3.5 million of our babies through forced abortion, sterilized hundreds of thousands of our women, and it's still ongoing. Then, they're forcing Uyghur women, especially our young women. If you remember earlier, I said Chinese government minders come to our home, and if they say, oh, if they like your daughter, because again, these are always males, if they like your daughter and they're like, oh, I want your daughter. If you refuse to give your daughter, let them to rape your daughter, essentially, they will send you to a concentration camp as well as your daughter.
Wow. Yeah,
So,
it's total dystopia. A lot of people, sorry to interrupt, but a lot of people, a lot of people don't know, but there's a huge femicide problem in both India and China where they have aborted all the females. So there's an overabundance of males, and that's what's going to happen in the Western world, and all over the world, really. So you're going to have all these Chinese and Indian men who don't have wives. They don't have a partner. So this is really, it's really bad.
This is where they coerce our women to marry Chinese men. And there's ads in China. They run ads across China's actual China where they promote this. They have ads saying that if you move to East Turkestan, because they're trying to encourage more Chinese settlers, especially if you're a male and you move there, they will provide you with an ethnic wife, a local so-called ethnic minority, meaning Uyghur, Kazakh, non-Chinese populations. You get free housing. You get 80,000 yuan, which is roughly about $15,000 US dollars, cash prize. You get all of these different benefits, including free land, from the Chinese government if you go colonize East Turkestan. So this is something that they've been doing. Tens of thousands of our young women are being forced to marry Chinese men. Then there's the organ harvesting aspect, which the international community is not really paying a whole lot of attention to. So before 2014, before China officially launched its genocidal campaign, the organ transplant industry every year in China there's about, quote, 5,000 to 6,000 organ transplants a year. By the end of 2014, that skyrocketed to over 50,000 organ transplants. Where's those organs coming from? The Uyghurs, because Chinese government, not only did they, before they took us into these camps, they took our DNA samples, our voice prints, and retina scans. In 2018, Chinese state media, Xinhua, which is their official state media, reported that they collected the DNA samples, voice prints, and retina scans of 36 million non-Chinese peoples, so-called ethnic minorities. That's the term they use. Ethnic minorities, meaning non-Chinese peoples. So Uyghurs, Kazakhs, etc. Between the ages of 12 and 65 under a voluntary free health checks for all program. Of
Right.
course, it's not.
They're
It's
always doing it with the most
Yeah,
beneficent,
of course
good
it's not
intentions, right? Yeah.
voluntary,
Yeah.
it's mandatory, and it's not a health check. They're doing that to, collect your data and then to match organs. And many of these Uyghurs are being killed on demand because our organs are being sold to wealthy Muslims from the Middle East and other parts of the world. Even today, right now, if you were to go to China, you can go to China, you'll wait maybe 72 hours and they'll have a fresh organ for you, like this. You just,
It's a
you gotta,
huge cash
yeah,
cow.
you
Yeah.
gotta pay, yeah, you gotta pay a lot of money, but they'll get it to you within 72 hours. You can get an organ transplant. And where are these so-called halal organs coming from? It's coming from the Uyghurs. They built a lot of crematorias initially to hide the fact that, we're dying. Um, According to organ harvesting experts and researchers like Ethan Gutman, anywhere from 25,000 to 50,000 Uyghurs between the ages of 18 to 30 are being killed every single year specifically for their organs. So this is a part of the genocidal aspect that no one really is talking a whole lot about. I mean, there's been some attention, but not a whole lot of attention from the international media, not a whole lot of attention and condemnation from global governments, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's disgusting. It's really sick, like what's going on there. And is this map accurate of all these little, forced internment camps and facilities and all that stuff? Does that look familiar to you?
Yep.
The Xinjiang Data Project. Wow. It's just like it's not in our news here in the States at all. It's not covered, at least as far to my knowledge. I mean, the mass media here is super corrupt in the United States.
I mean,
But
initially, we had some coverage, we had some outcry from the international community. We were like one of the things that I was successful in doing with the government in exile was getting global recognition of and condemnation of this genocide. We were able to get initially the Canadian Parliament to recognize it as a genocide and to condemn it, then followed by the U.S. Parliament, U.S. Congress, and an official genocide designation by the U.S. State Department in January 2021. But despite the recognitions, there has been no meaningful action to stop it. We filed a complaint before the International Criminal Court in July of 2020. We filed 5 additional dossiers of evidence calling on the International Criminal Court to investigate and prosecute, Chinese officials for genocide and crimes against humanity. But again, because governments and corporations are, involved in business and, quote, diplomacy and economics with China, they're reluctant to, to do anything that would harm their business interests connected to China, and that's why they're turning a blind eye. And yet we hear never again every year. Governments every Holocaust Memorial Remembrance Day, they vow never again, but never again is happening right now in the 21st century. Right now, our people continue to be enslaved. Our people continue to be sterilized. According to China's own judicial data, 578,500 Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples are serving anywhere from 5 years to life in prison. And this might seem like a small number or not like a whole large number, but when you look at it, East Turkestan, we make up less than 2% of the official population of the total PRC, right? We make up less than 2%. And in that, Uyghurs make up less than 1% of the total population of the PRC. Yet we make up over 33% of the total legally, imprisoned population. We're the most we're the most incarcerated people in the world. You won't find any
like
specific,
percentage-wise, right?
yeah, that is incarcerated as much, even number-wise, percentage-wise, number-wise. There's no one as much incarcerated as imprisoned as the Uyghurs. And this is happening right now in 2025. Of course, China continues to whitewash it. China claims that, oh, we provided them with jobs, we're fighting against terrorism, we're bringing them development, and that Uyghurs are happy. They've been inviting a lot of uh, influencers and journalists from countries that are close to China, and they're parading them across two main places in East Turkestan. One is the Urumqi. It's the International Bazaar, and so it's a tourist destination. So they're saying, "Oh, see these people," and so what they're doing is they're teaching ethnically Chinese people, Uyghur. They're teaching them how to dance like us, how to say a few things in our language, and then when international tourists and influencers and media come, they're pushing them to the front, and they're just putting a doppa on their heads. This is our traditional hat. They're putting traditional Uyghur clothing on them, and because the Western media for the longest time has misportrayed us as Chinese Muslims, you think, oh, these are Chinese people. They since they're Chinese, they must look Chinese, you know, and since they're Muslim, well, if they have a hat and they're wearing our traditional clothes, these must be the Chinese Muslims. These must be those Uyghurs that we're hearing about. And so this is what they're parading them. They're not parading actual Uyghurs. These are Chinese masquerading as us. And the Western audience, other people can't tell them, distinguish them, because, again, they're wearing our hats. And in their mindset, they've always heard them as Chinese Uyghurs. So they must be, Asian looking. In reality, majority of Uyghurs, we look more Middle Eastern or Indo-European. We don't have a whole lot of Asiatic features.
Right. It's just super grim. There's just a lot going on. It's just really kind of like and it also involves international conglomerates, right? Are using that labor. Nike and some of the Adidas. I mean, who are,
Apple, I
yeah,
mean,
Apple, yeah.
virtually every major industry out there is connected to Uyghur slave labor. You have to understand, especially the textile industry. So, 80% of China's cotton production is in East Turkestan, 80%, and that's 20% of the global, production. Then you have polysilicon. So you're talking about green energy, building, you know, becoming green, transitioning to that. Even that is tainted because 45% of global polysilicon production comes from East Turkestan, and that's 90% of China's total polysilicon production. That's 45% of the global production, and polysilicon is what is used to make solar panels. So all of that is tainted. You have even tomatoes. We produce about 25% of global tomato production comes from East Turkestan. So Heinz, companies like this, your ketchup is
Wow.
coming from.
Wow. That's incredible. I had no idea.
So it, and then aside from that, as I mentioned earlier, hundreds of thousands of our people have been forcibly moved out of East Turkestan to Chinese factories across China to work, from producing everything from, electronic, from your phones to electronic components to textiles to toys. So virtually every industry is tainted. And, those companies, they've refused to pull out of China. They continue to, you know, in fact, many of them lobbied the U.S. government or U.S. Congress to push back against specific bills like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and other bills that would hold them accountable. So this is the problem that we're having: is you have corporate interests that are, shaping how
Right.
governments respond to this humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, it really is a global issue, guys. People need to watch out. This is just going to be ongoing, and these kind of things like the surveillance and moved into concentration camps and things like that are something people should be aware of. And certainly about the predicament of East Turkestan. So, Lee, we're at the 60-minute mark. Is there anything you'd like to add before
Well,
we wrap it up?
yeah, like one thing I'd like to add is the fact that what's happening in East Turkestan is actually, in many ways, a test case especially the surveillance technology, the facial recognition technology. All of that is actually a test phase, and those technologies were given to China by Western companies, like Oracle, like others who are, continuing to manage, a lot of data in the West as well. And China has perfected that. They use East Turkestan specifically as a test case for their products that are now being implemented in the West and across the world as well. So speaking out against this is speaking out for your own privacy, speaking out for your own, future. Um,
Right.
and at the end of the day, like right now, everyone's saying, what can we do about it? One thing that we can do is speak out. Google the Uyghur genocide, learn more about this, speak out, organize events, try to raise awareness, write letters, call your members of Congress, tell them to act against this. Um, invite Uyghurs to speak and give you more information about this, at your local church, community center, etc. Um, Other things that we need to really focus on is like, okay, what can we do to stop this? Well, we have to address the fact that this is an ongoing genocide, and we have to focus on the root of this. What is the root cause of this? This is not China's not doing this to its own people. We're not ethnically Chinese in any way. We don't have any cultural, historical, or linguistic, or religious ties to China. China's doing it to a country that they occupied and colonized. So this is an issue that we need to understand. East Turkestan is not a part of China. China is occupying and colonizing another nation. And this is the root of the genocide that our people are suffering. And the only way to really end this genocide and bring justice and to ensure the survival of our people is through our independence, restoring our independence and national self-determination. So this is something that we need to call out for, is to condemn Chinese occupation and colonization along with the genocide, and to demand that the United Nations and other entities, governments that claim to be against colonialism, that claim to support the right to self-determination, support the Uyghur people's right to self-determination, and support their cause for decolonization and independence.
And Salih, where can people reach out to you? How can they find the East Turkestan government in exile?
So they can visit us on our website at east-turkistan.net, east-turkistan.net. They can follow our government in exile at ETExileGov on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. They can follow me at Salih Hudayar on social media, across all those platforms.
Yeah, I saw you. I just followed you on X, so I know you're on there. I'll put links to that. I'll put links to your website and the government in exile. And people need to see this dystopian kind of hellscape that's there now. These things get utilized, and then they figure out how to implement them elsewhere. So it's a warning to us all. And people, call your local congressperson. So thanks so much, Sully. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you again for giving us the opportunity.
Awesome.